the steel came down like a guillotine. Not one shutter. All of them. Every exit in the Cormorant Center dropped at the same instant, a sound like the whole building clearing its throat, and then the boom of 18,000 pounds of security steel meeting concrete at once, a sound that came up through the floor and into the soles of my shoes before it ever reached my ears. 9:15 on the dot. I know because I just looked at the clock above the Section 114 tunnel, the way you do when you're bored, waiting for a match you paid too much for. Watching the red digits tick over from 21:14 to 21:15 like they meant nothing at all. The crowd didn't stop screaming. That's the thing nobody believes when I tell it. Barrett Vaughn had just kicked out of a 3 count at the ropes, his shoulder coming off the mat a half-second before the referee's palm could land. And the arena was one solid wall of noise, so loud you could feel it in your teeth and in the little bones behind your ears. And the shutters could have been thunder in a storm nobody cared about. For maybe 40 seconds, the fight in the ring was still the biggest thing in the room. Beer cups were still going up in the cheap seats. Somebody 2 rows behind me was still screaming a wrestler's name until his voice cracked. I was the only one who turned around. Old habit. 22 years running facilities for buildings like this one, and your ears learn which sounds belong. That one didn't. It sat wrong in the mix. Too low and too total, a mechanical certainty underneath all that human noise. Emergency shutters don't drop during an event. They can't. They're wired to hold open when the house is full, hard interlocked to the fire panel and the turnstile counts. Because the last thing you ever want in a packed building is a steel wall between people and the way out. That's not policy. That's physics and law, and 100 years of dead people teaching us the lesson. Somebody had told those shutters to override every failsafe the building had, and the building had a lot of them. And I'd written half of them myself. I stood there with a paper tray of nachos going cold in my hand, the cheese already starting to skin over. And I thought, very clearly, in a voice that sounded like my own, but calmer than I felt, we are all locked inside. Before I take you through the rest of that night, I want to say thank you to everyone who keeps coming back for these stories. And if you're new here, welcome, I'm glad you found your way in. If this kind of survival story is your thing, stay with the channel and leave a comment if it gets under your skin. Now let me tell you what happened after the steel came down. My name is Wes Delacroix. I'm 51 years old, and I was not supposed to be working that night. I want that on the record because it changes how you hear everything else. I'd retired from the building 4 months earlier, handed in my badge and my keys and my 2-way, and let a younger man take the chair I'd worn a groove into. 22 years as the operations chief at the Cormorant Center. The arena that sits on the river in a mid-sized city I'll let you place wherever you want, because it could be yours. It could be the one you drive past on your way to work. I knew that building the way you know a body you've lived in your whole life. I knew which door stuck in humidity and needed a shoulder in July. I knew the elevator that lied about which floor it was on and would open on 3 when it said 5. I knew that the west loading dock smelled like diesel no matter how many times we pressure washed it, that the smell lived in the concrete now, part of the building's blood. That night, I was a guest. My replacement, a decent kid named Foley, had comped me 2 tickets as a going-away gesture, tucked them into a card that said something kind that I didn't deserve. And my son-in-law had bailed with a stomach thing an hour before we were supposed to leave, so I went alone rather than waste the seat. Section 114, row 9, aisle seat, because even retired, I want to be near an exit. You don't unlearn that. You spend 2 decades being the man who counts how fast a room can empty, and you never sit anywhere you can't leave from. So when the shutters dropped, I was maybe the 3rd person in the building to understand what it was. and the first with the keys in his hands, even retired, to understand it in his bones. Here's what a lockdown means in a place like the Cormorant. The building has two systems that most people never think about. Two nervous systems layered under the popcorn and the noise. The first is the crowd control shutter grid. Heavy rolled-down steel across every public egress, meant to seal the concourses off from each other in a riot or an active threat event. The kind of thing you install after another city has a bad night and the insurance company sends a letter. The second is the environmental containment system, which nobody outside facilities even knows exists. It was added 6 years ago, quietly, part of a federal grant after a wave of stadium safety upgrades that came in the wake of a scare in another country nobody wants named. It could isolate the building's air completely, seal the intakes on the roof, shut the exhaust, run the entire interior on filtered recirculation, a closed loop, the building breathing its own breath. The idea was chemical attack, a gas release in a packed house, the worst thing a room full of people can imagine. You seal the air so whatever's inside doesn't spread and whatever's outside doesn't get in. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, I'd argued against it for a year, because any system that can seal a building's lungs can also smother it. And I don't trust anything that can smother 17,000 people if it has a bad day. Both systems had just fired, together, and both were designed, by hard rule, in redundant code I'd helped write, to be impossible to trigger during a full house. I set the nachos down on my seat. I remember that detail because it was the last normal thing my hands did that night, placing a paper tray of ballpark food on a plastic seat, careful not to spill it, like I'd come back for it, like there'd be a second half to this evening where a man returns to his seat and finishes his snack. The screaming in the ring changed pitch, not all at once. It moved through the bowl like a wave, the way a stadium sound always does. And I stood there and watched it travel the top rows, going quiet first, as people up there felt the temperature shift, felt the air stop moving, then the middle deck catching it, then the floor. Somebody near the entrance ramp started pointing up at the ceiling, at the big rectangular vents along the roof line, the ones I'd walked catwalks past 1,000 times. And everyone's head began to tilt back, and I looked where they were looking. The vents were closing, slow-motored louvers folding shut on their long steel spines, one bank after another, sealing the sky out of the room. And I knew the sound they made even though I couldn't hear it from where I stood. A soft servo whir, the hum of a motor that services those dampers on a maintenance schedule I used to sign off on personally. In a building holding just under 17,000 people, the noise dropped so fast that you could suddenly hear the individual sound of a single child crying somewhere down in the lower bowl. Thin and clear, the way you hear one bird after a gunshot. Barrett Vaughn, in the ring, stopped selling the match. I watched a professional who'd taken chairs to the spine for a living, who'd bled for this crowd, on script and off, straighten up out of a pin, look around at the closing roof, and simply stand there in the center of the ring with his chest heaving. The referee's hand froze it too, hovering over the mat. The other wrestler rolled to his feet and dropped the character. And you could see it happen. You could see the story leave both their faces. The bell didn't ring. Nobody had scripted this. And the two men in the ring, more than anyone in the building, knew the difference between a work and a real thing going wrong, because their whole lives were built on the line between the two. The house lights came up. Not the show lights, not the reds and blues and the swinging spots, the house lights, the ugly, flat white ones we only used for cleaning between events. The ones that show every stain on every seat and every gray hair on every head. They flooded the bowl and made everyone look tired and afraid at the same time. Made 17,000 people look like what they actually were, which was 17,000 animals in a box. And that's when the noise finally turned. It stopped being a crowd noise. It became the sound a crowd makes when it stops being a crowd and starts being a trapped thing. A rising, ragged edge to it that I'd only heard once before in my whole career and hoped never to hear again. I moved before I thought. Down my row, sideways past knees and spilled drinks, up the aisle against the first trickle of people who were starting to stand, murmuring, asking each other the questions you ask when you don't want the answer. I wasn't running toward an exit. That's the thing. My legs were carrying me toward the section 114 the vomitory. The tunnel from the seating bowl into the concourse. We just call them voms in the business, because I needed to see a shutter with my own eyes before I'd let myself believe it. I got to the mouth of the tunnel, and there it was. Corrugated steel from ceiling to floor, filling the whole opening, sealing the concourse off from the seats. The concrete lip where it met the floor still had a scuff of rubber on it from the last time a beer cart had rolled through minutes ago, a whole lifetime ago. I put my palm flat against the steel, cold, fully seated in its track, no gap at the bottom, no light coming under. I crouched down, my knee popping, and looked at the base, at the emergency release keyhole that every one of those units has at floor level, the manual override built for exactly this situation. The one thing that's supposed to let a man with the right key raise the shutter by hand when the power and the electronics have all failed you. The keyhole was jammed. Someone had driven a key into it and snapped it off flush with the plate. You couldn't even get a pick in there. I ran my thumb over the sheared metal and felt the fresh burr of it, still sharp, still bright, not oxidized, not a day old. Steel that's been exposed for even a week starts to dull and darken. This was cut tonight, or close to it. This wasn't a malfunction. This wasn't a glitch or a power surge or a system I could talk back to life. Somebody had walked this building before the doors opened, before a single fan pushed through a single turnstile, and gone to each of these manual releases and made sure they wouldn't work. That's not a moment of panic. That's a morning of quiet, patient labor, with a hacksaw and a spare key, whistling to himself in an empty arena. I stood up slow. My knees told me I was 51, and my back agreed with them. And a woman near me, 30s, holding a kid on her hip, looked at my face. I don't know what was written on it, but it must have been something, and she said, in the flat, careful voice of a person deciding to trust a stranger, "You work here, don't you? You know how to open it." I didn't answer her right away, and I've thought about that pause every single day since. The concourse on the other side of that steel was where the exits were. The real exits, the wide glass doors to the parking structure and the river walk. The ones that led out into the night and the world and the drive home. We were sealed in the bowl, cut off from the concourse, and the concourse itself was cut off from the outside by another layer of the same steel. 2 walls between 17,000 people in the night. A box inside a box. "There are keys," I told her finally. "There's a control room. I know where it is. But I need you to help me not start a stampede, or none of it matters." Her name was Talia Osei. She'd come with her nephew, an 8-year-old named Desmond who was wearing a foam championship belt around his waist. The cheap gold vinyl kind they sell at the merch stands for $30. And he'd stopped smiling. She was a charge nurse at the county hospital, though I didn't know that yet. And I found out later that within the first 10 minutes of that night, she'd already started doing triage in her head, counting the building's population and its exits and its weaknesses the way I counted its systems. 2 people running the same math from 2 different directions. She was the first person I trusted that night, and I trusted her almost immediately. Because when I said don't start a stampede, she didn't argue and she didn't panic. She understood exactly why, and she turned around and put her back to the shutter and started telling the people nearest her to sit down, to breathe, that the building's crew was on it, that help was coming. Her voice pitched low and steady and certain, the voice of a woman who's talked frightened people through the worst nights of their lives for a living. Help wasn't coming. I knew that already, though I didn't say it. If the air containment system had fired, then the building was broadcasting to the outside world that it had sealed itself on purpose, deliberately. And every emergency protocol I'd ever written or read said that first responders would stage a perimeter and wait for the all clear from inside before they cut through anything. They'd assume there was a reason the building's sealed. They'd assume someone competent, someone authorized, someone with the codes and the training had made that call for good reason. That's how the system is designed. That's how it's supposed to work. Nobody competent had made that call. Or, and this thought arrived slower, colder someone very competent had, for reasons I couldn't yet imagine, and had made it in a way that would keep the cavalry standing politely outside for hours. I found Foley, my replacement, 6 minutes later. And that's when the night went from a crisis with a cause I could fix to something with a shape and a will behind it. He was at the Section 110 VOM with a cluster of yellow-jacketed event staff and 2 off-duty cops who'd been working the show as security detail, the way off-duty cops always do at these things for the overtime. Foley was 29, sharp as a tack, the kind of kid who'd actually read and memorized the operations manuals I wrote instead of leaving them to gather dust on a shelf. And when he saw me push through the crowd toward him, his whole face did a thing I've only seen on people who are drowning, and see a boat coming, relief so total that it's almost shameful to witness. The look of a man handing a weight to somebody older. Wes, thank God. Oh, thank God. The board's locked. I can't get into the containment override. It's asking for a second authorization, and I don't have it. I never had it. That was your... Slow down. I took his shoulder, firm, the way you steady a ladder. Look at me. Walk me through what you see, not what you feel. What fired? He got himself together. He was good, Foley, under the panic. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and made himself talk like an operator instead of a scared kid. Both grids, shutter grid and containment both. Timestamp on the log is 21:15 exactly. Not a fault code. There's no fault code. It's a clean command. Someone entered it as a scheduled event. Scheduled. The word sat in my mouth wrong, like a coin you weren't expecting to bite down on. You're telling me somebody programmed this to happen at 9:15, ahead of time. It's sitting in the scheduler like it's a lighting cue for the show. Full containment, timed execution, no confirm required. I've never seen it configured that way in my life. The confirm step is supposed to be mandatory, hard-coded. You physically cannot skip it. He looked up at me, and the next part he said quieter, like an accusation he was ashamed of making. You wrote the confirm step. I had. 6 years ago, when we installed the containment system, over the objections of a vendor who thought I was being paranoid, I'd built in a 2-person rule, a nuclear launch kind of thing. 2 authorized users, 2 separate credentials, entered within 30 seconds of each other at 2 different physical terminals on opposite sides of the building. Both or nothing. I built it because the idea of any one human being able to seal 17,000 souls into a windowless box terrified me even as a theoretical exercise on a Tuesday afternoon. I'd insisted on it. I'd been proud of it. It was the single best thing I ever added to that building. And it had just been walked straight through like a screen door. "Who has the second credential now?" I asked. "After me." "You said you don't have it. So who did you assign it to when I left?" Foley's mouth opened, and nothing came out for a second. His eyes went somewhere over my shoulder, doing the thing people do when the answer arrives, before they're ready for it. "Then, there's only 3 people in the whole system with second-tier auth. That's it. Me, except mine only covers the shutters, not containment. HR never bumped me up before you left. You and they never deleted your login, Wes. You're still active in the system. I'm sorry. That's on HR. They were supposed to, and they didn't. And Renner." I hadn't heard that name in a while, and hearing it now dropped my stomach clean through the floor. Dale Renner had been the building's electrical and controls contractor for 8 years. Not an employee, a vendor. The man whose company handled all our low-voltage systems, the access control, the network, the very containment grid we were standing under at that moment, breathing its recycled air. Smart, patient, boring in the specific way that makes you trust a man completely, the way a good accountant is boring. He'd been in the building 1,000 times, on weekends, at 3 in the morning during outages, in the crawl spaces and the plenums where nobody else ever went. He'd have known every one of those manual releases well enough to snap a key in each one without hurrying, without breaking a sweat, humming to himself. And he'd had a second-tier credential because you simply cannot service a 2-person authorization system without the ability to test both halves of it. I'd signed off on giving it to him myself. I'd thought it was reasonable. I'd thought he was reasonable. "Renner's not here tonight," Foley said, and I could hear him wanting it to be true. "Is he? Why would he be? He wouldn't come to a wrestling show. The guy doesn't even like sports." "Pull his badge activity," I said. "Right now." Foley crouched over the little ruggedized laptop the security team kept for exactly these moments, the one that ran off the security network instead of the building automation. And his fingers moved fast across the keys, and then they stopped. Just stopped, hovering. He turned the screen slowly so I could see it, and he didn't say anything, because it said everything. Renner's badge had entered the building at 4:52 that afternoon through the west loading dock, more than 4 hours before the shutters came down. And there was no exit swipe, no matching out. The column was empty. He was inside. He'd been inside since before the doors even opened to the public. He had sealed us all in from within, and he was somewhere in the same building I was standing in, breathing the same finite air, sealed into the same box he'd built. And the only reason a man locks the door with himself on the inside is that he's decided, for certain, that the inside is the safe place to be. That's when I asked the question that cracked the whole night open. I asked Foley what the containment system was actually for. Not the answer in the brochure. Not the line we gave the board and the press. The real one. Because a chemical attack containment system seals the air, yes. But the intake louvers up top hadn't just closed to keep something out. They'd sealed the building into a closed loop, breathing its own breath. And I'd stood on that catwalk and watched the intake dampers themselves seal, not just the exhaust. And there's only one reason you seal a building against its own outside air, from the inside, and lock 17,000 people in while you do it. You do it when the danger is out there. When something outside the walls is worse than being trapped inside them. I told Foley to pull the exterior camera feeds. He said the exterior feeds were the one thing still live, the one thing untouched, because the cameras ran on the security network, a separate spine from the building automation. And Renner apparently either hadn't bothered with them or hadn't been able to reach them from where he was. The kid brought up the loading dock camera first, out of pure habit, because that's the one we always checked first, every morning, for 22 years. Wes Dock, the one that always smelled like diesel. The dock was full of people who were not people anymore. I need to be careful how I describe this, because I've spent a lot of time since trying to separate what I actually saw on that grainy feed from what my mind did with it in the moment, in the adrenaline, in the ugly white light. There were maybe 30 of them on that camera, pressed against the closed dock doors from the outside, packed into the cone of the sodium vapor lamps that turn everything that color of old bruises. They moved wrong. That's the honest version. The version I'll stand behind. Not shambling, not slow, not the way the movies teach you to expect. They moved like people who had forgotten they had joints, fast and jerky and stuttering, limbs at angles that hurt to look at. And they were hitting the steel doors with a rhythm that wasn't random. All of them striking at once, then a pause, then again, all together, like something was counting for them. The sound of it wasn't reaching us through the walls, but I could see the dock doors shudder in their frames on the feed, could see dust shake loose from the header with each impact. Talia had come up behind me. Desmond wasn't with her. She'd left him with a cluster of other kids and their parents that she'd already organized in the space of minutes. And I'd learn later that she did it on purpose, positioned herself so that the boy wouldn't be able to see her face when she saw whatever it was we were about to see. She looked at the screen for a long time without saying anything. Longer than I could have. "Those are patients," she said finally, very quietly, almost to herself. "That gate. That's not fear. That's not somebody trying to break in. That's neurological. You've seen that before? We had cases start coming in 3 days ago." She said it flat, a nurse's flatness. The tone I'd come to recognize as the sound of a person holding something very heavy, very still so it won't spill. We were told not to talk about it. Not to each other, not to family, not to anybody. High fever first, spiking fast, then aggression, then that. Exactly that. The county sent a memo Thursday telling us to keep afflicted patients in physical isolation and wait for state guidance before any transfers. She looked at me, and something moved behind her eyes. The state guidance never came. We kept asking. It never came. 3 days. There had been 3 days of this out in the city, out beyond the river. And I had spent them cleaning out my garage and sorting boxes of old work manuals and feeling sorry for myself about being retired and useless. And not one of us at that arena had heard a single word. Dale Renner had heard, somehow, somewhere. Renner had known, and known enough and early enough to act. And Renner had a second-tier credential and 8 years of intimate knowledge of exactly how this building could be turned into the strongest sealed box in the county. He hadn't come to a wrestling match. He'd come to bunker down, to ride out the end of the world in the safest structure he had access to. And he'd used our own containment system to do it. And he'd used my old credential to authorize the second half of it. Which meant he'd gotten into my login. Which meant this had been planned in the kind of granular, unhurried detail that takes weeks, not hours. He had sealed the building to keep the infected out, which was, God help me, the correct call. That was the thing I couldn't get around, even standing there hating him. If those things on the dock had gotten inside among 17,000 packed, seated, trapped human bodies, it would have been the worst mass casualty event this country had ever seen. in the space of about 10 minutes. In a room with the exits jammed by panic. Renner locking those shutters might have saved every single life in that building. But he'd done it without a word of warning to anyone. He'd done it at peak crowd, at 9:15, when the house was fullest and the aisles were quietest and the fewest people were on the stairs. And he'd snapped the manual releases so that even the people who knew the building better than their own hands couldn't undo it. He hadn't just sealed the danger out. He'd sealed his own escape and everyone else's. Deliberately, permanently. And I couldn't for the life of me work out why a man would trap himself along with 17,000 strangers unless he had a way out that the 17,000 didn't. A plan they weren't part of. "Where does the loading dock feed run to?" I asked Foley, mostly to keep myself moving, to keep from staring at the screen. "If those doors fail—" "They won't fail," Foley said, too fast. "Those are the same grade steel as the shutters. Rated for—" And then he stopped himself, because he'd heard his own voice, heard the shape of the sentence. Rated for. Everything in a building is rated for a number. And the number always assumes that nobody on the other side is trying that hard, that long, without stopping, without tiring, without fear. On the screen, the infected on the dock stopped hitting the doors, all at once. Every one of them went still in the same instant, the way a whole flock of starlings turns in the air on a signal you can't see. And then together, in perfect unison, they all turned their heads and looked up and to the left. At the camera. They should not have been able to see it. It was a black dome mounted 40 feet up on the dock header, in the dark, above the throw of the lamps. There was nothing there for a human eye to find. And 30 of them found it at once. "They're not random," Talia said, very softly. And I heard her take a slow breath through her nose. "Look at that. They coordinate. That's not a mob. A mob doesn't do that." I want to tell you I stayed calm. What actually happened is that my hands went cold, and my mouth went dry, and I made myself count the resources I had left. Because counting things is the only prayer I've ever really known. 2 off-duty cops, Foley, Talia. A ruggedized laptop with a set of live cameras. A building I knew better than any living person on Earth, except for the one man who'd sealed us into it. 17,000 people in the bowl behind us, who did not yet understand that the reason they couldn't get out was the exact same reason they were still breathing. And somewhere in my building, in a room I could picture down to the chair, Dale Renner waiting for something. If you were standing at that shutter with me knowing those things outside were the whole reason it was locked, would you have wanted it opened anyway? Tell me honestly, because in all these years, I've never once been sure of my own answer. Let me tell you what I decided. I decided to find Renner, not to hurt him, whatever the cops wanted, to understand him. Because a man who plans this carefully, this far ahead, has also planned for what comes after 9:15, for the hours and the days that follow. And I wanted to be standing next to that plan when it started to matter. Because it was going to matter to 17,000 people who had no idea it existed. The control room for the Cormorant Center sits behind the Section 122 concourse on the east side, tucked in among the electrical rooms and the network closets where the public never goes. But we were sealed in the bowl, cut off from every concourse by the same steel. So the front door of that control room might as well have been on the far side of the moon. Except I hadn't run that building for 22 years without learning the ways through it that aren't on any drawing. There's a maintenance chase behind the Section 116 VOM. or a narrow vertical shaft that carries conduit and a steel access ladder between the bowl level and the concourse, sealed at the bottom with a steel panel that the AS-built drawings swear is welded permanently shut, but that I personally had ground open 11 years ago on a Sunday, because I was tired of walking the long way around every time I needed to get to the rigging attic. The event staff didn't know it opened. Foley didn't know. It wasn't in any manual I ever wrote, because some things a man keeps for himself. And I'm not entirely sure why, except that I've noticed the same instinct in myself that I hated in Renner. I told Foley to stay glued to the cameras, to keep the crowd calm through the section reps, to feed me anything he saw change. I told the two cops a lean older one named Ruiz with gray at his temples and a slow, careful way of moving, and a younger, heavy-set one named Kolb, who kept touching his holster like he was checking it was still real to come with me. And I told Talia to stay with the kids where she was safe. She said no. "You'll want a medical read on Renner if you find him," she said, already stepping past me. "And if that man's been sealed in a building for 4 hours knowing what's out there, with those things outside, you have no idea what his head is doing right now. You want somebody who reads people for a living standing next to you when you open that door. Desmond's with the Ferris family. They've got 3 of their own. 1 more is nothing to them. I'm coming." I didn't argue. I've never in my life been any good at arguing with someone who's already right. And she was right twice over. The maintenance chase was exactly where I'd left it. Behind a rolling equipment cart in the dead corner of the 116 VOM, where the ushers stored the folding wheelchairs, the ones we kept for guests who couldn't manage the stairs. The access panel was scuffed and dented, but unwelded, just like I remembered. And I got my fingers into the seam at the edge and worked it. And it came free with a scrape of metal on metal, and cold conduit-smelling air came breathing out of the dark shaft, that particular smell of dust and copper and old grease that lives in the guts of every big building. Ruiz clicked on a small flashlight and put the beam up the shaft. A steel ladder climbed 20 feet or more into the dark toward the concourse level, the rungs shining faintly where 1,000 hands had worn them smooth. "You first," Ruiz said low. "It's your rabbit hole. I'm not going up a hole I can't see the top of." I went first. My shoulder complained on the second rung and my grip wasn't what it had been at 40, but the body remembers this kind of thing. Halfway up I stopped dead, because I heard something in the shaft that wasn't the 4 of us. A soft mechanical ticking, steady, patient. And I put my free hand flat against the fat bundle of conduit running up the wall and felt it, vibrating. Faintly, constantly, alive. Data moving through it. The whole shaft was packed with the building's nervous system. And it was live, humming, working, which meant the network was up, which meant that somewhere at the top of it, in my old chair, Renner was still driving. We came out through a hinged panel into the section 122 concourse, and I will never forget the silence of that place. The concourse of a sold-out arena, completely empty. I'd seen it empty before openings and after closings 1,000 times, but never like this. Never with the popcorn still on the floor and a drink cart abandoned mid-pour. The soda tap still open and dripping a slow thread into a puddle of cola that had spread across the terrazzo and gone flat. The shutters had come down between one heartbeat of ordinary life and the next. A single, dropped soft pretzel sat in the middle of the floor. Somewhere down the curve of the concourse, a small radio left on behind a vendor's stand was playing soft music to nobody at all. A station that didn't know the world had ended. An ad for a car dealership fading into a love song. The control room door was 40 feet away, down the empty curve, and the light was on inside. A hard line of it under the door, spilling out onto the terrazzo. Ruiz drew his sidearm and held it low along his leg, professional, unhurried. Kolb did the same, but his hand wasn't as steady. I put my own hand up, palm back toward them, slow down. Because a man who plans a night this well does not sit in a lit room by accident. Renner wanted to be found. The light under that door was an invitation. And invitations from careful men are the ones you walk into slowest of all. The door was unlocked. The handle turned under my hand without resistance. I opened it. Dale Renner was sitting in my old chair, in front of my old board, with a rifle laid across his lap, not raised, not pointed at us, just resting there across his thighs. A bolt-action hunting rifle. The kind a careful man owns and cleans and stores responsibly and takes deer with in November. He was 50-something, gray at the sides, thin through the face, and he was calm in a way that I recognized instantly because it was my own kind of calm. The calm of a man who has already done his grieving in advance, privately, for whatever is about to happen, so that when it comes, he can meet it with his hands steady. "Wes," he said, the way you'd say it running into someone at the hardware store on a Saturday. "I hoped it wouldn't be you. I really did. I ran the guest list twice this week. You weren't on it." "Comp ticket," I said. "Last minute. My son-in-law got sick." He nodded slowly, taking that in, and something in his face broke a little at the edges, a small collapse. And I understood that my simply being there had ruined something for him, some cleaner version of this night that he'd built in his head. A version where the one man in the world who could undo his work wasn't in the building to try. "You sealed it," I said. "I sealed the building." "Those things are on the west dock, Dale." "They're on all four sides," he said quietly. "You've only got the one camera up, I'd guess. The dock. I've got them all right here." He reached out one finger and turned the center monitor a few degrees toward me, and there they were. On a grid of feeds, the whole Cormorant Center ringed with them. Hundreds. Far more than I'd let myself imagine from that one dock camera. Pressing against every door and every dock and every ground floor pane of the arena, like the tide coming up a beach in the dark. The city's gone, Wes. It went this afternoon. It went while everybody out there was parking their cars and buying beer and arguing about who was going to win the belt. I've been sitting here watching it happen on the traffic cams for 3 hours. There is no perimeter out there. There is no line of squad cars, and there is no all clear coming. Not tonight, not tomorrow. There is just this building, and the air we've got in it, and the water in the tanks, and the fact that these doors will hold as long as nobody is fool enough to open them. Ruiz's gun came up an inch, just an inch. You trapped 17,000 people in a box. I saved 17,000 people, Renner said. And the terrible thing, the thing that made my stomach turn, was that he wasn't wrong. And he knew he wasn't wrong. And knowing it clearly hadn't made it hurt him any less to have done it. If I'd sounded an alarm, if I'd gotten on the PA and told them what was outside, they'd have stampeded the exits in 90 seconds. And the exits open outward, Wes. You know that better than anyone. You signed the drawings. They open outward, into the parking structure and onto the Riverwalk. Into that. He gestured at the wall of monitors, at the tide. The panic itself would have opened the doors from the inside and let it all in. So I took the choice away from them. I made it clean at 9:15 because that's the moment in the run of a show when the fewest people are on their feet. Fewest bodies on the stairs. Fewest chances for someone to fall and start a crush. I ran the numbers 100 times this week. I ran them until I couldn't stand to look at them anymore. You snapped the manual releases, I said. Every one of them, by hand. So that nobody would open the doors before they understood what opening the doors would do. He looked at me, level and tired. You'd have opened them, Wes. The old you. First 10 minutes, get the people out. That's the reflex. That's a good man's reflex. And I love you for it. And it would have killed everyone in this building inside a quarter hour. I couldn't have you or Foley overriding me in those first minutes, before anybody could see the feeds, before anybody could understand. So I made it so you couldn't. Here is the thing I have to tell you honestly, because I promised myself when I started telling this story that I'd tell it straight or not at all. In that moment, standing in the doorway of my old control room, I did not think Dale Renner was a villain. I looked at him, and I thought I was looking at a man who had made the single hardest correct decision I had ever heard of, and had made it entirely alone, in the dark, without anyone's permission or comfort, so that the rest of us wouldn't have to carry it on our own souls. That was the moment, right before I found out what he'd actually done. Because Talia had drifted past me while Renner and I talked, quiet, over to the far corner of the control room, to a stack of gear that didn't belong to the building. Renner's gear. The things he'd carried in through the dock at 4:52 in the afternoon. And now she was standing over it. Gone very still, that same stillness from the camera feed, the stillness of a person holding something too heavy to move quickly, and in the flat light, I could see her shoulders had gone rigid. "Wes," she said, and her voice had changed. "Come look at this." It was a crate. A hard-sided medical transport crate. Gray, ruggedized, with a foam cutout interior, the kind used to move things that break or spoil. And the lid was open, and inside the foam were slots. Neat rows of them, each one shaped and sized to cradle a single vial. I counted them without deciding to, the way I count everything. 40 slots. 12 of them still held vials. Small, amber, sealed with a crimped metal cap, each with a printed pharmaceutical label I had to lean down and squint at in that ugly white light to read. It was an antiviral. A serum, batch-numbered, marked with the kind of institutional coding that doesn't exist for a disease a city hasn't officially admitted it has. 12 doses remaining in a crate built and foamed for 40. And I understood in one cold, dropping instant that 28 of them were already gone, and that the empty slots weren't empty tonight, because the foam beneath them was clean and dry, and the residue crusted at the necks of the used positions had already dried to a hard amber varnish. Days old, not hours. "Where did you get this?" Talia said. It wasn't a question yet. The nurse's flatness had a crack running through the middle of it now. "This is a hospital allocation. This is county property. This is a controlled shipment, Dale. There were supposed to be..." She stopped, and I watched her do her own arithmetic, watched the number arrive in her face. There were exactly 40 of these doses in the entire state. I saw the manifest on Thursday. 40. 40 doses for the whole state, and they were being distributed to the hospitals for the frontline staff and the earliest cases. And they never arrived. Not at ours, not at any of them. We were told the shipment was lost in transit. We were told there was an accident. Renner didn't say anything. He looked at his own hands. "You took the shipment," she said, and her voice was climbing now, tight and controlled and furious. "You took all 40, on Thursday, 3 days ago. You knew, 3 days ago, exactly what was coming. And instead of warning anyone, you took the cure." "I knew Wednesday," he said quietly. And there it was. The floor of the story I thought I'd been standing on gave way beneath me all at once. And I understood, cold and complete, that the calm, careful, tragic man in my chair had not sealed this building at 9:15 to save 17,000 strangers. Not first, Not really. He had sealed it to save the 12 people the 12 remaining doses were for. "Who are the doses for, Dale?" I said. And it didn't come out as a question, because I already knew. I just needed to hear him say it. Renner met my eyes. And for the first time since we'd walked in, he was the one who looked away. "My wife," he said. "My daughter, my son-in-law, my grandson, he's 10. 3 men I served with, and their families, what's left of them." He swallowed, and his throat worked. "There are 11 people in a room on the club level who are here tonight as my guests. I brought them in this afternoon before the doors opened, before the crowd came. They're in the Renner suite I bought at Wes. I bought a private suite for the season under my company's name 18 months ago. Back when all this was just insurance. Back when I was just a paranoid old man buying a room with its own bathroom and its own ventilation zone and its own scrubber in the strongest, most sealable building in the entire county. And telling myself I was being ridiculous. 11 people I love in that room. 12 doses in that crate. 1 to spare in case I miscounted. In case one broke. I did the math, and it made me physically sick, a cold rush up the back of my neck. You sealed 17,000 people into a building to protect 1 suite. The doses aren't even for the crowd. The crowd is just... The crowd is the wall, Renner said, and his voice finally cracked all the way through, and it was so much worse than if he'd shouted. The crowd is 17,000 bodies and 17,000 voices worth of steel and concrete and noise, standing between the things outside and the 11 people I could not save any other way on this earth. I am not proud of it. I have not slept in 4 days. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Wes. I would never ask that. I'm telling you the truth because you found me, and because you of all people deserve the truth, and because in about 40 minutes, none of it is going to matter anyway." "Why 40 minutes?" Talia said sharply, snapping back from the crate. "What happens in 40 minutes? He looked at the board, at my board, at a number glowing on it that I hadn't let myself look at yet, because I'd been looking at his face the whole time. "Because the containment system's filters aren't rated for 17,000 people, he said. They're rated for a controlled evacuation window. An hour, 90 minutes at the outside, of sealed, recirculated air for a full house before the CO2 climbs past safe and people start going down. I plan to be sealed in a suite with 11 people and its own independent scrubber. I did not plan for the main bowl to stay full. I never wanted the bowl full. I wanted them to file out the normal way over the next hour. And by the time the last of them hit the parking structure and understood, my people would be sealed away safe. But the shutters and the containment fired together. And now the whole house is sealed with the whole house inside it." He looked up at me, and there was something almost pleading in it. "You know this system, Wes. You wrote its specs. You argued with the vendor about the filter banks for a week. Run the number yourself. You don't have to take my word for anything." I ran it. I didn't want to. My mind did it without asking my permission, the way it does. The main bowl scrubbers, the recirculation volume, the total sealed air. 17,000 people breathing it down. He was right. He was right. And it was worse than he'd even said, because I knew the filter banks hadn't been serviced on the schedule I'd left behind. I could tell from the maintenance log Foley had shown me an hour earlier, the gaps in it. And I hadn't clocked what it meant at the time. We had less than an hour of breathable air left for the crowd. And the only way to make more air was to break the seal. And the only thing on the other side of the seal, on all 4 sides, was the tide. Renner had built himself a room that would keep 11 people breathing and alive, while the other 17,000 ran quietly out of air in the dark. That was the plan. That had always, from Wednesday, been the plan. The stolen doses were never the last problem to solve. The doses were just the reason for all the rest of it. "You have a scrubber in that suite," I said slowly, feeling my way through it. "A separate ventilation zone. That's the whole reason you bought that specific suite and not another one." "Yes." "How many people can it keep alive?" He didn't answer, and the silence was the answer. 11, 12, at the absolute edge of its rating, gasping. Not 17,000. Not 1,700. Not 100. Not the crowd. Never the crowd. If stories like this are the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, stay with the channel. I'll walk you all the way to the end of this one, I promise you that. Because here is the part where I had to decide what kind of man I still was. 4 months into being nobody. A retired guest with a cold tray of nachos on a seat somewhere, and no badge and no authority, and no right to any of it, except that I knew the building. Ruiz tried to solve it the simple way, the way cops are trained to. He steadied his sidearm on Renner's chest and said flat, "You're going to open the doors, or you're going to open that suite for the rest of us. And right now, I honestly don't much care which one you pick." And Renner, without any drama at all, without so much as a flinch, lifted his hunting rifle off his lap and laid it on the desk and slid it well away from himself, out of his own reach, and put both hands flat on his knees where Ruiz could see them, and said, in a voice gone gray with exhaustion, "I can't open the doors. Not the way you mean, officer. Not anymore. The mains are sealed and I disabled every manual release in the building myself. By hand this morning. You've seen the keyholes. Wes saw them. Even I can't raise those shutters from here now. I made certain of that. I made it so that not even I could lose my nerve at 3 in the morning and let everyone in this building die by trying to save them." He looked at Ruiz's gun without any fear at all, just a bottomless weariness. "You can shoot me where I sit. I won't stop you and I won't blame you. But it will not move the steel 1 inch. I built it that way on purpose. That was the entire point. I removed myself from the decision so that there wouldn't be a weak moment, so there wouldn't be a bad hour, so nobody's mercy could reach the levers. There is no decision left to make, officer. There's just the air running down, and the doors holding, and the 11 of them living. That's all that's left." The room went dead quiet. Ruiz's gun didn't drop, and it didn't fire. Kolb was breathing loud through his mouth by the door. And I stood there in the middle of it and understood finally the real shape of the trap. Renner hadn't just sealed the building. He'd sealed the possibility of anyone changing their mind about it. He had engineered a single night in which no good man could do the good thing, because the good thing, opening the doors, saving the crowd, letting the people out, would kill all of them in 15 minutes. And he'd reached into the world and torn the door out of it, unmade it, so that mercy simply had nowhere left to go. 12 doses in a crate, 11 people in a scrubbed room, 17,000 people in the dark breathing borrowed minutes, and a control room where every lever that mattered had been snapped off flush at the root. But he'd made one mistake. One. He'd said it himself and hadn't heard it. Even I can't open them from here. From here. I had ground open a maintenance chase 11 years ago that wasn't on any drawing in any file Renner had ever seen. And more than that, I had installed the containment system's rooftop components myself 6 years ago, which meant I knew one thing about that system that Renner could not possibly know, because I'd added it after his crew had wired and commissioned the mains on a Saturday, alone, off the books, and I had never once logged it or told a living soul. There was a hard mechanical bleed valve on the primary air intake plenum, a manual butterfly damper, red-painted, on the roof-level intake up above the bowl, reachable only from the maintenance catwalk that runs above section 104, 40-some feet over the seats. It could crack the building's air seal open by hand. No power, no network, no authorization, no Renner. Not the doors. It couldn't touch the doors. The air. And the intake it fed was 40 feet up the outside of the building, behind a fixed steel louver and a bird screen, in a spot no infected on the ground could ever reach. I'd built it because I have never in my life trusted an automated system to be the only thing standing between a room full of people and suffocation. I'd built it and told nobody, in exactly the same spirit that Renner had unbuilt every release and told nobody. Two paranoid old men, 6 years apart, wiring our private fears into the same steel skeleton, and only one of us had thought to leave a door open on his way out. I looked at Talia, then at the board, at the CO2 number climbing steadily toward a red line I'd once set myself. Then back at Renner, who was watching my face the way I'd been watching his all along, and I saw the exact instant he understood that I knew something he didn't, that there was a variable in his 100 runs of the numbers that he'd never had. And I watched him understand that the decision he had so carefully removed from the world had just walked back into it, standing in the control room doorway wearing my tired old face. "There's a way to give the crowd air without opening a single door," I said. "Isn't there, Wes?" Renner said it for me, quiet, almost admiring, almost grateful, the way one old builder speaks to another. "You put something into my building that I never knew was there. Rooftop intake, manual butterfly damper, catwalk access above section 104. No power, no network, just a wheel and a man to turn it." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he was already running it, fast and unwilling, the same way I had, the numbers moving behind his face. "It'll pull the CO2 back down for the whole bowl, yes. It'll buy the crowd air, hours of it, maybe all night if the outside air holds clean. But—" he held up one finger, not a threat, a caution. "It'll also equalize the pressure across the whole envelope. Right now this building is sealed, positive the containment system's holding a slightly higher pressure inside than out. And that's part of why those things can't wedge the door gaskets, why the seals are staying tight. It's the pressure pushing the doors closed from inside. You crack that intake and bleed the plenum, you lose the positive pressure. You give the crowd air, and in the same motion, you make every door in this building a little bit easier to force from the outside." He looked straight at me. "You'd be trading a certain quiet death for the whole house, for a possible fast and loud one for everybody, if a single door gives while there's air enough for panic. That is the actual choice. That's the exact choice I took out of the world so that no living soul would ever have to stand there and make it. And you? Wes, you just put it back on the table." That was the decision. The entire night had narrowed down to one red valve on one steel catwalk, 40 feet over 17,000 upturned faces. Crack the intake, and 17,000 people breathe, but the wall that's keeping the tide out gets weaker. And if one door fails, it fails inward into a crowd with nowhere to run. Leave it sealed, and the doors hold like a fortress while the air runs down, minute by minute, and 17,000 people quietly, gently lose consciousness in the dark over the next 40 minutes. And 11 people in a scrubbed suite live to see the sun come up. I want you to sit inside that for a second, the way I had to, because I'm going to tell you what I did, and I need you to have felt the full weight of it first, both ends of it in both hands. If you were standing on that catwalk with your palm on that cold red wheel there for everyone but a weaker wall, or a strong wall, but air for only 11. Which way does your hand turn? I've told this story more times than I can count, and I have never once heard the same answer twice from any two people. I turned the valve. I'll tell you exactly how I got there, because the getting there was its own ordeal. The catwalk above section 104 runs the full length of that side of the bowl. A graded steel walkway suspended 40-some feet over the seats. The path maintenance uses to hang rigging and swap out the big highlights and run cable during load-in. To reach it from the control room, I had to go back down through my unwelded chase, climb past the concourse level, up into the rigging attic that sits in the roof structure, and then out through a hatch onto the catwalk itself, out over the whole silent bowl. And it was silent by then. Silent enough that when I stepped out onto the grating, the sound of my own boots on the steel carried down into the dark. And I looked over the rail and saw 17,000 pale faces tilt up toward me at once. The whole trapped house turning its eyes to the sound of a single man walking on metal above them, the same way the things on the dock had turned to the camera. For one long swimming second, I felt the entire building looking at me, waiting to see what I was, and I had to grip the rail and breathe before my legs would carry me forward. Talia had come with me as far as the rigging attic and stopped there, because someone had to get back down to Foley and the section reps and be ready. Ready for air, or ready for the other thing. Before I ducked out onto the catwalk, she caught my arm, her grip stronger than I expected. And she said the one thing anyone said to me that whole night that I still hear, clear as if she were standing beside me now. "Whatever's on the other side of that valve," she said, looking right at me, "you're the man who left a door open, not the one who closed it. You hold on to that when this is over, no matter how it goes." The damper was right where I'd left it 6 years before. A red-painted wheel on the side of the intake plenum, where the big ductwork came down into the roof structure, gone stiff with 6 years of disuse and dust. I braced both feet against the base of the catwalk rail and got both hands on the wheel and put my whole body into it, all 51 years of it. And for a moment, it wouldn't move at all, and I thought the corrosion had beaten me. Then it gave, all at once, with a low iron groan that carried down into the silent bowl, like the building itself moaning. And I hauled it around, one full turn, two, feeling the linkage let go inside the duct. And then I felt it, the whole building exhaling, the pressure changing in my ears, a soft pop and swallow, the way it does in a plane coming down through cloud. And cold, clean, river-smelling night air came pouring down through the plenum and into the ductwork and out into the bowl. And I heard it reach the crowd before I could see it. A sound moving through 17,000 people. Not a cheer, nothing like a cheer. Something far quieter and far more terrible than a cheer. The sound of a single, enormous trapped animal being allowed, all at once, to breathe. I stood on the catwalk with my hand still on the wheel, and I felt the positive pressure drain out of the building through my own ears. And I knew that 40 feet below, all along the perimeter, at every door and every dock, the gaskets had just loosened by a hair, that the seals that had been holding the tide out had just gone from tight to merely closed. And somewhere out there in the dark, hundreds of them had just found the walls a fraction weaker than they'd been a second before. And I had done that, on purpose, with my own 2 hands and my own old secret. And it was the right thing, and it had made us weaker. And both of those things were completely true at the same time, and neither one canceled a single gram of the other one out. The doors held. That's the thing I have to tell you, because you've been braced this whole time for them not to. That night, the doors held. The tide pressed and the steel groaned, and dust came down from the door headers And twice I heard a boom roll through the building that stopped my heart, but the steel held. By 3 in the morning, the crowd was breathing cold, clean air, and the CO2 number on my old board had dropped all the way back down into the green, where I'd first set the line 6 years before. And the 11 people in the Renner suite lived. And so did the 17,000 in the bowl, all of them, every one. And Dale Renner sat in my chair and watched his careful, terrible, 100 times run arithmetic get overturned by a single valve he'd never known existed. And he wept quietly, hands still flat on his knees, not from fear and not from relief, but from something I think was worse than either. From the unbearable weight of having been ready, willing, prepared to let the whole world end in that bowl, to save 11 people, and being spared, at the last hour, from ever finding out for certain whether he'd have actually gone through with it. We were cut out at dawn, not by first responders, not by the cavalry. Renner had been right about that. There was no cavalry left to come. But a National Guard engineering unit, one of the last organized things left moving in that dead city, reached the building at 6:40 in the gray morning, cleared the tide that had gathered thickest at the west dock, and cut through the dock shutter from the outside with a rescue saw. The sound of that saw coming through the steel from the far side, the shriek of the blade and the smell of hot metal, was the first true sound of the world coming back that any of us had heard in 9 hours. And grown men sat down on the concrete floor and put their faces in their hands when they heard it. The doses. You've been wondering about the doses this whole time. Talia took the crate. 12 vials. She'd been running triage in her head since 9:15, since the first camera feed. And she had a list, not a list of who deserved to live. She'd never have made that list. But a list of who was already showing the fever, the earliest cases hidden inside a crowd of 17,000. The handful of people who'd walked into that arena already carrying it and hadn't known. She found them in the long dark hours, moving through the bowl with Foley and the section reps, a nurse's hands and a nurse's eyes. And she used 11 of the 12 doses on strangers, on the sick she found in the crowd. And the 12th she gave to Renner's 10-year-old grandson, not because of who his grandfather was, but because in the dark of that endless night, the boy had made a friend, another kid, and the friend had spiked a fever. And it turned out the friend was the grandson. And by then Talia had already decided the boy got a dose the same as any other sick child in the building. She's a better person than I will ever be. I've made my peace with that. Renner never used a dose on himself. There wasn't a spare in the end. Once Talia had done her work, there were exactly enough for the sick. But even before that, he'd never reached for one. I don't fully know what happened to Dale Renner after the guard came. They took him. There were hard questions waiting about a stolen state shipment and 40 missing doses and a building sealed at peak crowd with 17,000 people inside. I gave my statement, all of it, every word, sitting on an overturned crate with a blanket around my shoulders as the sun came up over the river. I told them the truth. The whole shape of it, including the part where his seal was the only reason a single one of us had lived long enough to run out of air. And the part where I was the one who cracked that seal back open with a wheel he never knew about. And the part where both of those things were just as true as each other, and neither one ever stopped being true. They asked me, at the very end, off the record, one of the guard officers, exhausted and young and human under all the gear, what should happen to him? To a man who saved 17,000 lives with the exact same act that would have ended them, who stole a cure to save the 11 people he loved most in the world, who built a room where mercy couldn't reach and then sat down inside it and waited to find out whether that made him a monster or a father. I didn't have an answer for him. I still don't. And somewhere along the way, I've decided that not having one is the only honest place to leave it. Because I've come to believe there isn't a clean answer to be found. So I'll ask you the same way that officer asked me, and I mean it as a real question and not a storyteller's trick to end on. Dale Renner sealed the doors to save 11 people. And in doing it, he saved 17,000. Then he sealed away the very possibility of anyone opening those doors again, so that no good man could kill everyone by trying to be kind. He was right about the danger. He was right about the panic and the outward opening doors. He was right about the air. And he took 40 doses of the only cure in the state and kept 12 for the people he loved, while a whole city died in the streets outside. What should happen to a man like that? Tell me down in the comments. And tell me where in the world you're listening from while you're at it. Because I've read every answer that's ever come back to me on this one. And I still don't have my own. I keep coming back to the valve. The one I built 6 years ago and never told a living soul about. Out of the very same fear that made Renner snap those keys off, flush in their plates. 2 men, wiring their private nightmares into the same steel skeleton of the same building. And the entire difference between us, the whole moral weight of that whole night, everything it comes down to, is that when I was afraid, I left a door open. And when he was afraid, he took every door away. I don't know if that makes me a better man than Dale Renner. I honestly don't. I know it made me the one standing on the catwalk with his hand on the wheel. And I know that most nights, still when I can't sleep, I lie there in the dark and I feel that building exhale all over again. I feel the pressure change in my ears. And I hear 17,000 people breathe in all at once. And even now, all this time later, I cannot tell you for certain whether I turned that wheel because it was the right thing to do, or because I simply could not stand to be the man who didn't. That's the part nobody warns you about, the part that stays. The steel comes down at 9:15 on an ordinary night at a wrestling match, and you spend the rest of your life living on the far side of it, breathing air you're still not entirely sure you ever had the right to open.